you will only, as of 2035, be able to buy an alternative fuel vehicle. There's only two types, right? There's electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, and then there's another technology called fuel cell electric vehicles that uses hydrogen, combustible hydrogen, that turns into electricity via a fuel cell. The science is complicated, but it's really promising. And there's a whole class of driver for whom battery electric vehicles is not either very appealing or not very practical. And so the consensus right now is, in order to get to a fully decarbonized, right, non-internal combustion fleet, probably 60% lend themselves well to battery electric vehicles. But the other 40% are probably going to have to be something else. And that something else right now is fuel cell electric vehicles.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of SACTOWN Talks. Today we're glad to be joined by Senator Josh Newman. Senator, thanks for joining us. How's it going?
Going well. Thanks.
Yeah, good.
Thanks for having me.
Good to finally connect here again. For those of the listeners that don't know your background, can you kind of tell us, what were you doing before you decided to run for Senate in 2016?
What was I doing? I'm an Army vet, worked in a bunch of things, including digital media for a number of years. And what I was doing before I decided to run as a veteran in around 2012, I got really interested in the question about why young veterans coming home from other places to California, having served, especially during two very long wars, were having so much trouble finding work. And so I got to work trying to put together an initiative to help vets, connect vets to employers that could benefit from their talents. And through that, I got very involved in the local advocacy community, and that kind of led to meeting a bunch of elected people who always said nice things about veterans, but often their follow-up wasn't good. And so there was a moment, I think in 2015, where I was grousing about that. My wife kind of goaded me into thinking about running by saying, if you really want to change things, our state senators turned out in 2016, which I was impressed that she knew that. It turns out she didn't mean it. She's regretted it a million times, but she'll admit that she's the one, who gave me the idea. And that's what got me thinking about running in 2016.
So you were career military. When did
No,
you?
I wasn't career military at all. I went from college. I went to school at Yale, and I was the only kid in my class who joined the Army after graduation. And I was interested in kind of seeing a part of the world that I'd read about, right? I'd read about in books, but I hadn't seen. And so I served from 1986 to 1990. Got out as a captain, and then did a bunch of stuff, but not career by any means.
So, you just quickly said there, you went to Yale. Did you go to Yale with anyone that you're currently serving with?
No, I think Yale members of the legislature, or I guess broader Yale graduates, Rob Bonta's a Yale graduate, our Attorney General, Cotty Petrie Norris, my colleague, is younger than I am. He's a Yale graduate. And then I was a year behind Steve Mnuchin, whom I don't know. And I was a year ahead of Brett Kavanaugh, whom I also don't know.
Good.
And I was in the same class. I found it recently, this guy named Joe Tsai, who owns the New York Nets and is apparently worth like several $1 billion. Don't know that guy either, right? So
you should.
I'm obviously a huge underachiever.
Yeah. So, okay, you're in the military. You get out in 1990. Then kind of what did you start doing?
So I actually, my first, real job, I wound up kind of stumbling into an opportunity, offered the chance to work on a mayoral campaign in San Francisco. And the candidate I worked for wound up winning. So I went from being like intern to issues director to deputy press secretary.
So what is that, Frank Jordan?
Frank Jordan. Yeah. You're good at your mayors. Yeah. So Frank Jordan, former chief of police, and was a surprise kind of underdog success. And then wound up working for a couple of years for the mayor of San Francisco. And I'd been a politics and government kind of, I was a history major at Yale, but I studied, that was my emphasis, 20th century American politics. And I will admit that I was continually shocked that politics didn't work like all the books I read in college. So I think I got kind of disillusioned, and I think I had a moment where I realized I probably don't really have the temperament for public service, because I probably talk too much. And so wound up, you're getting the whole story. So I had a girlfriend at the time who wanted to move to Southern California. And she wanted to work in the film business. And so I was like, okay, let's go do that. So we both moved down to LA area. We broke up like 2 weeks later. And I wound up working in film and TV for, started out as just kind of a lark for about 6 years. Worked on a bunch of movies and television shows, some of which you may have seen, like The Nanny and some other things. And so my real claim to fame, it follows me around, was I worked on the movie Austin Powers, the first Austin Powers.
Nice.
Right. And I am, just because somebody didn't show up and I fit the uniform, I'm one of the security guards who gets shot by the fembots in that one scene. And so you
Nice.
can look it up on YouTube. It's very brief, but that's basically my crowning achievement in the entertainment world.
And do we have the IMDb credits to go with it?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a bunch of credits and a bunch of the Brady Bunch sequel movie, a movie called Brady Baby Geniuses, another movie called City of Industry that. Like they make a lot of movies. I worked on a bunch. Yeah.
Any good stories working with Michael Myers and the crew there?
When you work in a movie, you're seeing a version of it, kind of all cut in different directions. So I will admit, and this was the first Austin Powers, right? There were multiples.
Right.
I was convinced that it was a dog, right? Like, I had a bet with a guy who worked for me. Like the movie we worked on about the babies who could talk, like that's genius, right? Like, that's going to make a lot of money. Get away way more money than this thing. It winds up being kind of an iconic movie. And because I'm in it for like 5 seconds, my colleagues think that's cool.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think you're much cooler now.
Well, of course. I'll get less cool as we move along.
So I remember, so you're running in 2016,
2016,
right in the midst of the craziness of 2016. And this was a Republican seat, right? And you kind of came in as a surprise. And your claim to fame is that you wore a bear costume to get elected.
No. Yes and no. Yeah. So the myth up here in Sacramento is that, to give it context. So I was running and I was the third guy in. There was established Democrat, established Republican, and I was new guy, right?
Yeah.
And so, and I thought I had a pretty good case, right? Veteran, business guy, all that stuff, centrist, in a district that was kind of a toss up by then. It was probably like R+1 when I started. It was like D+1 by the time the election came around. So it was in transition, but I thought I had a pretty good case to make. But what I get a lot of attention for, what I did at the time was I had this idea. Here's the story. My wife and I were doing this deliberate thing. We were going around the district, every weekend to get to know it, right? That Stephen Colbert thing, like got to know a district. So we'd go out to a different restaurant in a different city. There's 16 cities in Senate District 29. And one night we were out, we had Peruvian food or something in Diamond Bar. And my wife said, hey, there's an ice cream place nearby that's really cool. It's called Afters. It's in Chino Hills, one of the cities. It's an outdoor mall. And so we went, and this place Afters, if you've never been there, it's one of the places that kind of serve you like artisanal ice cream, right? And then they roll it up in like cereal, like, Lucky Charms. Right. And then the coup de grace was they put it in a donut, right? They press it into a donut. So it was like a diabetes special. And it's pretty good, right? But it's kind of gross if you think about it. So we go there and it's on a Saturday night and there's a line was like, 100 yards long. All these young people obviously out on dates. And so my wife says to me like, hey, you're running. Like, why don't you go talk to these people? Tell them you're running for state senate. And I said, like they're all on dates, right? Nobody wants to talk to me, on their Saturday night thing. And just then these two kids walked by and they were in costumes. And then I remember there was a young woman dressed in kind of a princess costume. And she was with a guy, and the guy had a dog outfit on. It was like a dog costume. And I noticed all of the kids were getting out of line to have a selfie taken with Dog Kid, right? So I said to my wife, I was like, that's what I need. I need a mascot, right? If I had a mascot, like I could walk around with my mascot and everybody, I could get people to take their picture. I could capture the email. I worked in internet stuff, did a lot of marketing stuff at the time. And so I said to my wife, what do you think? She said, I think that's a stupid idea. And I said, well, you're not the target demo. Like maybe, talk to other people. So I want to talk to the younger people. They're like, that's kind of an interesting idea. So I went online and I found a company that sold college mascot costumes. And they had the whole, portfolio of all the different animals. And I thought, California bear. Right. So within the bear category, there were all these different choices. So I opted for California grizzly bear instead of like Mama Bear and Joey Bear.
Right.
And so the thing came in the mail, and it was really professional, right? It was this big head, right? And, made of paper mache or whatever. But the body was like really heavy. And by then it was like April. And so this is where the myth starts. So I thought, wow, I'm going to hire some kid, put him out like in a bear costume, and they could like get heat stroke, right? Because it was everything. So I thought I'll lead by example. I was in the military. So I went out one day and I thought like, I'll test it just to see if I'm going to kill somebody in this thing. So I went out and I remember it was in Anaheim. And it was on the corner of Catella and Beach. And I stood with a big Vote for Newman sign on the intersection of it. Deliberately, it was an intersection that got a lot of traffic. Right. And I stood out there with the costume on, feeling like the biggest jackass in the world, kind of waving, thinking like,
that's right by Disneyland, right? Like,
well, no, it's going west. It's going kind of away from, it's going like to the more working class part of Anaheim, like where it hits Stanton. And so I thought like, this is like really embarrassing. Then I realized like, nobody knows who I am. They don't know that.
No pressure.
Me. And I realized it was a good idea. People were waving. And I remember the woman blew me a kiss. Like, I was like, well, that's awesome. And I realized I had a good idea when I saw a UPS truck coming down the street, and I could see the driver, and he was like, big burly dude with like a tank top and all these tattoos. And he started waving at me like a little boy, like, hi, like that. So I thought that's a good idea, right? So I wound up hiring a bunch of kids off Craigslist, right? And surprised they had a lot of turnover. Turns out it's not that awesome to stand in a bear costume in the heat, but I never hurt anybody. And by the end of the primary season, I had these two young people that worked for me. They were super reliable. And it was a guy and his girlfriend. And he'd go out in the costume, and she'd stand next to him. He would wave and have the sign, and she'd hand out pamphlets at like intersections as people stopped. And then I wound up finishing second ahead of the other Democrat in the primary. And so I got the costume back as of June primary. We had a bunch of time. And I found out why they were so reliable, because the costume reeked of marijuana, right? So they clearly, they were getting a little baked and standing out there. Time flies, apparently, like when you're doing it that way. But the reason it became like my, thing I was known for was the wrap-up article in the Orange County Register, where I was the surprise story that kind of nobody guy beat the Democrats' choice, who outspent me 7-1, had all the endorsements. Right. And so Martin Wiskel, who was then the political reporter for the Register, called me, and he did a wrap-up story. How'd you do it? And I kind of, said the obvious, like, I think I had a good case to make, blah, blah, blah. And so then he called me back about 15 minutes later and said, hey, there's a picture of a guy in a bear suit on your website. Do you mind if I use that, if we take that and use that in our story? And I said, sure, no problem. And then he texted me like 10 minutes later and said, hey, Josh, is that you in the bear suit? And I didn't really think much about it. I said, I wrote back, that was me on that particular day, but only because I didn't have anybody else at the time to wear the bear suit. But that got kind of construed in this article that like kooky dude, right? Like walked around in bear suit.
Right.
Right. And we all know that story about like, somebody in a little town in like Montana runs their cat for mayor and everybody votes for it. But so when I started coming up here during, the general season, everybody was like, well, wow, you're the crazy dude in the bear suit. And I wore the suit, I swear to God, like all of 4 times, right? And I could sort of figure out the 4 specific times, but one time was just like to train a new guy, right? Whatever. But that has sort of stuck, as part of my political persona somehow.
Aura.
And, and then when I meet people,
legend of Josh Newman.
I'm on a podcast. So if you're not watching this, if you're watching this, you can see I'm like the most average dude in the world. And so I'm not, it just seemed like good marketing. And so it was among the various things I've done by way of marketing. Politics is a kind of marketing where you just thought if you have to get people's attention, right? And you don't have a lot of money in that case, in that time, but more broadly, like people are so jaded by most political stuff that I've tried any number of things that are kind of unconventional. So before that, I had this remote control blimp, right? Which was cool, but people had to look up, right? So it was kind of limited in its impact. During the recall campaign, I had this pedal bike thing. I thought was a good idea. It didn't work. And then the last campaign, I still have it. I have an ice cream truck that's branded Better Senator Ice Cream, right? You deserve a Better Senator ice cream sandwich. And we've taken that thing around. I've given out like 125,000 ice cream sandwiches at this point. And turns out people love ice cream and they love the price. It's free.
That's awesome. So like this is kind of our favorite time of year where we got a bunch of people running, a bunch of close races, a bunch of propositions. And it seems like the campaign consultants go to is mail, right? We're going to mail stuff. We have all this new stuff, digital advertising, Instagram, Facebook. My kid's YouTube account is blaring with Dave Jones commercials, but you're like the one candidate who goes out there who's trying new kind of novel things. Kind of what are you seeing that works and doesn't work, and kind of what should people be looking at now that they're not?
So politics is funny because you get one shot. Right. So, you can't, in internet stuff, you'd A/B stuff. Like, let's do 2 versions of something, see what works. But when you're running, like everybody, who's brave enough to say, I'm not going to do X or Y of all the things that have historically always been deployed. And so there's this kind of adage in advertising that's attributed to a guy named Wanamaker that had a department store in Philadelphia, and he allegedly said, like, we know for a fact that 50% of our advertising budget doesn't work. We just don't know which 50%. Right. And I think that applies to politics in spades. And so I'm, I think as jaded as anybody at this point when it comes to various, conventions in political advertising or campaigning. And so I'm not sure mail works very well. I know it's very expensive. I know who makes money off it. But I know also that I, as the recipient of political mail, I don't read any of it.
Right. Trash.
And I've actually had the experience of reading mail and thinking, well, that's bullshit. And I realized that's for me. Right? Like, I mean, that's for me in my campaign.
Right.
And so, and I lots of affection for all the consultants that I know and with whom I've worked. But I'm not really sure that if you think about it by way of like, what's your best yield, on the precious resource, the monies that you get from all the people who contribute. I'm not sure that mail works particularly well. Social media is one of these things that it's ubiquitous, but you don't really know how much, mind share attention you're getting from people.
Right.
Text messaging has become kind of the go-to thing, but I must get 10 text messages a day. And part of me always feels like, I'm a candidate. It's a golden rule. Like I should, give all this stuff kind of my attention. But now I text back, stop to end, stop. Because everybody's tired of it. And so, there's that broader question, which is like, how do we connect to voters? And I actually think it's an important question, irrespective of how you do it. But, how do we engage the people who vote so that, you get known as a candidate? But more broadly, if you think about what voting really is, voting is how we as, citizens hire the people who work for us in the public sphere. And, I'm all for anything that sort of reduces the barriers and gets, the people who are running closer to the people who vote so that we make smarter decisions. And part of that is incumbent upon the candidate. But it's also true that the public has a role to play in this as well. And so we're living in a weird time where the average person knows probably way more about the Kardashians, or about fantasy sports than they do know about their elected representatives or civic processes. And so, it's a real problem. So I've never done anything just to be, kind of unconventional for its own sake. It's really about to solve for that problem, which is, how can I go out and first meet people, but then find a context to have a discussion with somebody about what's important to them and kind of what I have to offer as a public servant.
No, that's fascinating. Is, how do you get people's attention and hold it, right? And that's something that you seem to kind of have grasped here.
And I'll tell you what, so the ice cream truck thing, right, has been interesting because, my consultants, right, like I have consultants like everybody else, were just shocked and, apparently like indignant, right, that I had spent so much money on an ice cream truck that I bought from some dude off Craigslist. And they were like, well, how much money did you spend on it? I said, it was $18,000. I paid a guy, but I got a whole ice cream truck, right? And they were like, well, that's outrageous, right? Because we need that money for stuff we do.
Right.
And I was like, listen, like your mail, right? Like it's $50,000 for one piece of mail that I'm never convinced that people really read, right? And even if they do, I wouldn't hold it against them that they said, like, it sounds like everybody else. So, it's work in progress, I think. But, I have this idea for next legislative year. We should, anything you do to sort of put people closer to the voters, even if it's uncomfortable, I think it's a good thing. So, two ideas we're exploring as legislation. One is when it comes to the ballot statement, right? Everybody, if you adhere to contribution limits, you get to put a ballot in the ballot book that everybody gets in the mail. But if you read those ballot statements, it's pretty obvious to anybody that they were written by professionals, right? I can read them in my era and I could tell you which consultant wrote which ballot statement for, a particular candidate. And so the idea is to legislate that if you're going to have a ballot statement in the book, that you would have to actually go down to the registrar's office and sit in a room and write that thing out, like you would in
the driver's test.
No, well, like in high school, like for an exam. And you can say anything you want. I'll give you as much time as you want. Can't spell check it if I have my way. Not connected to the internet. You can memorize it if you're smart enough to. But those would be your words. And I think people would actually find that a lot more interesting and illuminating. And similarly, excuse me, another idea to create a video ballot statement, right? So, we write these things, but everybody's doing everything, TikTok, et cetera, video. Like, wouldn't it be better if you could see 2 minutes of every candidate expressing themselves, same background, not produced by anybody, and say like, I'm Josh Newman, here's why I'm running. So exploring both of those things this year by way of legislation.
No, yeah, that'd be interesting if you could go like an elections website, right? You could have a video and some information about who's running and what they're about versus, just reading this paper.
Why not, right? I mean, why not? And so we had a call recently with Orange County, is a very good registrar's office. And they were concerned about some of the mechanics or the resource constraints, but I think otherwise seemed receptive. I mean, it seems like a natural evolution to me.
Yeah, no, totally. There's something you've raised a couple times now, as you said, we have different problems, and you are officially a problem solver. You're head of the problem solvers.
I'm a head. I'm not the head. Yes, of a thing called the problem solvers.
Leaders of the not problem makers, but problem solvers. Kind of, how did you come to join and come to be a problem solver?
So there's a thing in DC, right? In the, at the federal level, a group of legislators, I think it's give or take 50, who call themselves the Problem Solvers Caucus. And the goal there is to, find a bicameral basis to look at problems and, find solutions that otherwise, are offset or undermined by partisan politics. And so Adam Gray, 2 years ago, as I was coming back into office, got a hold of me and said, "Hey, we're trying to create something similar at the state level." For my part, after he explained it, it makes sense to me, right? So one of the defining features of being here in Sacramento is the lack of kind of interaction we have between the parties, and to a lesser extent between the houses. And so, for my part, I thought, that's cool. Let's create a space where legislators from both houses, but also both parties, can look at problems and see if there aren't, better bases for, thinking about policy solutions that don't start with a partisan frame of reference.
Right.
And so I'm, there's two of us, or there have been two of us over the first 2 years from the Senate, me and Senator Hurtado. And so I'm one of the co-chairs. And then the prior co-chairs were Chad Mays and Jordan Cunningham, and they both turned out. So their replacements are Heath Flora and Carlos Villapudua. So we are collectively, the chairs of this effort. Mm-hmm. And as the new class comes in, we're going to go out and try to recruit, hopefully somewhere around 15 members that are open-minded, right? Everybody's going to have an R or a D, but that are interested and willing, to be part of kind of this, this sort of slightly different effort to say, hey, certain problems that have always been either informed by politics or prevented from solution by partisan politics.
Right.
And they're pretty obvious, right? Campaign finance reform, climate, housing, a bunch of other things. What if we started from a different point? What might we come up with that we could turn into legislation? So it's been a really interesting experience so far.
Yeah, you mentioned there's kind of these, I don't know if you want to call them third rails or something, these things that we've had to fix, right? We know mm-hmm. we have to fix it, like homelessness, housing, mm-hmm. climate change, and they can get partisan, right? They can get there's a block in the road, we can't get around this rock. How do we do it? But there's solutions out there, and I think kind of like homelessness has been a big one, right? For years, this has been a problem. We've had money, we've had resources, we've thrown resources at it, and it's not getting any better. And so it's kind of how do we get to the root of the issue to find out, what is the problem and how do we solve it?
Right. And I guess if you ask the question, are these inherently partisan mm-hmm. problems that, do they need inherently partisan solutions? I mean, the answer is clearly homelessness, clearly not. Right. But because of, kind of conventions and assumptions, right? We often come at these things from a very partisan direction. And to your point, I mean, we have literally spent billions of dollars on homelessness and clearly not having the impact that anybody hoped. And these are very difficult, very challenging problems. I mean, homelessness is not one problem. It's a series of problems that kind of create the larger phenomenon. And so for my part, I'm a pragmatic guy. And so I'm actually very proud in the last 5 years, I've gotten funding in each of, the last budgets to fund a local, regional, effort to get at the root problems of homelessness, and which is now really cool. It's 11 city collaborative kind of regional effort. We had the governor come down last week to look at it. And I think it's a good model for prospective replication in other parts of the state. But that was really because we took the input of local officials, especially chiefs of police, about how to do this better, as opposed to the more conventional, here we are in Sacramento, let's solve this problem from the top down.
Yeah. Another issue kind of you brought up was kind of climate, and kind of you've been a big proponent of kind of alternative fuels, not just looking at electric or just one solution for all. And kind of you did this SB 1329 kind of with hydrogen vehicles and kind of hydrogen as a future. Kind of how can we meet, these zero emission goals without using kind of alternatives like hydrogen and stuff like that? And why are these alternative means kind of necessary to get where we want to go?
Right. I guess part of the answer is that we can, meet California's current decarbonization goals. So, as of, I think, end of August, the California Air Resources Board voted on a rule that as of 2035, the sale of new internal combustion engines will be prohibited in California, right? So as a matter of policy, you will only, as of 2035, be able to buy an alternative fuel vehicle. There's only two types, right? There's electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, and then there's there's another technology called fuel cell electric vehicles that uses hydrogen, combustible hydrogen that turns into electricity via a fuel cell. And the science is complicated, but it's really promising. And there's a whole class of driver for whom battery electric vehicles is not either very appealing or not very practical. And so, the consensus right now is, in order to get to a fully decarbonized, right, non-internal combustion fleet, probably 60%, lend themselves well to battery electric vehicles. But the other 40% are probably going to have to be something else. And that something else right now is fuel cell electric vehicles. And so we're at the very beginning of creating, an ecosystem, if you will, for people who drive a hydrogen fuel cell car like I do. But in order to do that, you need access to fuel. In order to have fuel, it has to get distributed to retail locations, and then it has to be produced, right? And ideally, it has to be produced in kind of the cleanest way possible. So California's goal is to instigate the evolution, the adoption of this technology to create an economy around it. And so the bill that I did last year was to expedite the investments to have enough retail stations so that we can meet the market. There's sort of a bootstrapping thing that has to happen. You have to have enough access to fuel for people who want to buy the car. You have to have enough cars on the roads for big companies like the energy companies, like Chevron, et cetera, to want to invest in the transition to these new fuel types. And so once you get to kind of takeoff speed, if you will, it should be a self-sufficient platform, but we're not quite there yet. We've had the good fortune in the last couple of years that the state's budget's been really, really sound. I mean, the state's finances are really good. So I was hoping for, let's expedite that development so that we can ensure that by 2035, there's a fully functioning market so that manufacturers like Toyota, Hyundai will be able to sell cars to people who will then be able to buy fuel. So that if you're a delivery driver, if you for certain other kinds of uses, like if you drive a pickup truck and you work for yourself, you do not have time to go charge your car, right? While you're doing your thing. And then other kind of more challenging energy intensive needs like trucking, like marine, like aviation. All of those things are going to need a fuel source that's not battery electric. That's where hydrogen comes in. So I bought a car a couple of years ago deliberately to be part of this kind of emerging economy.
And how's your experience with it?
It's been really interesting. And so the car is awesome, right? It's the best car I've ever owned because it's super fast, right? Totally
What is it?
It's and let's make an advertisement for Toyota. So it's the Toyota Mirai. Mirai means future in Japanese. But it's basically, it's a Lexus, right? It's a Lexus like ES350 that has been converted to the hydrogen's the fuel source. And so totally quiet. It'll do well over the speed limit. Not going to tell you how far over the speed limit I've been. With making no noise at all. It's a great car. The challenge is finding fuel, right? And so, it's about 60 stations across this big state. There's about 6,000 gas stations, right? Which tells you kind of what you're up against. And on any given day, it's often hard to find fuel because the whole kind of supply chain hasn't really been worked out. So on the one side, it's great. I get to drive in the carpool lane. I get this awesome car. On the other hand, it's, you're always trying to figure out, like, where am I going?
Right.
How much fuel do I need? Because it's, if you have a battery electric car, you can go charge somewhere. It's either slower or faster. You got a hydrogen car, like, you need hydrogen. It goes into your tank at 10,000 pounds per square inch. AAA can't come to you on the side of the road with a bag of hydrogen. So we're, hopefully we're getting there. But it's really important to get from here to there. We have to be really deliberate as a matter of policy, as legislators, to make sure that we provide the resources and the incentives so that the market evolves the way we hope it will, the way that we've defined by law that we need it to.
Right, because we've incentivized electric cars a lot, right? Like we've done a lot for Tesla and other manufacturers here in the state, incentivizing the purchase of these cars.
Right.
Kind of what can we do for hydrogen, and what are we doing?
Right. So the first order of business is to build out the infrastructure so that manufacturers like Hyundai, like Toyota, want to sell these cars to our market. And if they do, it's really to the good for everybody. But you need a platform in place for that. So as a matter of policy, California's policy as a result of Bill AB 8 was passed, I think in 2009, 2008. It's supposed to be neutral, right? It's about zero emissions technology, not about battery, not about something else. But the emphasis has clearly been on batteries, right? And batteries have obviously captured the public's imagination, in large part due to, I think, the success of Tesla and some other things. But when you take into account the reality that there's a whole slice of the driving public, that part of the transportation economy that doesn't work well for battery electrics, and also taking into account that, like, these investments are really big, and so and then you have the grid demands. So hedging your bets, if you will, is important. And so, my goal with that bill and kind of some of the other work I've done is just simply to make sure there's a level playing field.
Right.
Right. And then from there, let's let the market work itself out.
It's kind of interesting because, we're here celebrating California moving into the fourth biggest economy in the world, but we've kind of gotten to the fourth kind of by default, right? Like Germany's kind of taken a step back,
Right.
and a lot of it's because of energy problems, right? Poor policy decisions they've made over there that's kind of hamstrung them, right? They've put all their eggs in some basket. What can we do to kind of learn from that lesson? It's kind of, as you're seeing, like even the playing field, like let's not pull all our eggs in solar and batteries and kind of look
Right.
at some of these alternatives.
Well, I'm always intrigued, so there's this meme, I guess, about, the size of California's economy relative to other economies. And so it sort of, asserts, at least indirectly, like that we're like a sovereign nation.
Right.
And we're not, right? We're one of 50
No.
states, right? And so like we're an awesome, economic engine, but we're not really the fourth largest economy in the world, right? I mean, we're one of 50 American states. So America is still the largest economy in the world. More importantly, when it comes to climate and energy, irrespective of fourth or fifth, we are 3% of the world's emissions. And so because we become kind of enamored of this idea that California is like its own country
Mhm.
or a world unto itself, we've fallen into this kind of interesting, I don't want to call it a trap, but I guess it is, this idea that we can solve the climate problems on our own. And, we can certainly lead by innovation, right? And that's what California, I think, has historically done, especially by way of like fuel economy and some other really smart regulations that then get adopted by the rest of the country,
Right.
rest of the world. But we can't do these things on our own. And so we often conflate, sort of progress with salvation or purity. And that's a mistake in my view, because in the end, the market is going to decide. In the end, individual consumers have to have both a reason and also the wherewithal to adopt these new technologies. And that's the balance I think you have to find. And so I'm all for, aggressive goals, but it's really the difference between encouraging innovation or this kind of false belief that we, California, can do this on our own. We can't. And to the extent that we create imbalances,
Mm-hmm.
it's a real thing that the market gets to decide. People can move to other states. Companies can move to other states.
Right.
If you make California's, inputs too expensive, gasoline being one, there are reasons for that, and I think you can justify them. But there's an upper limit that where you don't see a real return. In fact, you can see some really negative unintended consequences.
Yeah. Kind of speaking of unintended consequences, we're here home to Silicon Valley, a lot of technology, and with that comes a lot of batteries. And kind of what do you do with those batteries when you don't need them anymore?
Yeah, so I'm glad you
right?
asked. Having sounded like not that invested in climate change solutions, and I am. Don't get me
Right.
wrong. I'm proud. We did some work last year in concert with Assembly Member Jackie Irwin to try and solve this real problem of battery recycling in California, right? So if you just think about all the batteries in our lives these days, right? And so you've got two types: disposable batteries, the little AA, AAAs that we use in all kinds of things. But then more recently, lithium-ion batteries that are in all kinds of devices, and especially embedded in products that you buy, like even kids' toys that come with a lithium-ion battery. And there aren't really good structures for recycling those batteries. And so Jack and I carried two bills. Mine was 1215 to sort of split this problem and solve it. Her bill handles disposable batteries and creates a framework for better access at retail. So if you have battery, everybody knows on some level you're not supposed to throw those batteries out. They are environmentally hazardous. The lithium-ion batteries that people throw out are actually really dangerous. If they get crushed in a garbage truck, they can cause fires. If they get crushed at a waste facility, they cause massive fires that can disrupt everybody's recycling, all the waste management. And so, the goal is to kind of solve for that problem while creating a regime to recycle batteries. So my bill creates a new process within the Cal waste system, the e-waste process, to smartly create incentives to take those batteries, get them to a recycling center, either the kinds you have in your community or the ones, or the programs run by like your local church or school or whatever, where they take your e-waste and then we pay them for it. And hopefully that goes a little further and it starts to solve that problem. Is, technology often predates solutions for absorbing it. And this is a good example. And so, environmental hazards of batteries are real. But more importantly, we need to be thinking about these things deliberately, because the next step is recycling car batteries, right? And they are massive, right? And so if you can't recycle the little battery that came with your kid's toy,
Right.
imagine the challenges we're going to have when all of these electric cars, they probably have a lifespan of give or take 12 years, start to come back around, and we have to figure out what to do with, their components, especially the lithium-ion batteries.
Yeah, that's kind of a lot of things we hear from people who are opposed to electric cars is, basically we're having these ticking time bombs that are creating this big kind of waste issue.
Mm-hmm.
What is the reality of recycling a car battery, and is it kind of possible to recycle it back into a new battery?
Well, now you can reuse a lot of these things for secondary uses. And all the components are in theory recyclable, but if they're mixed in with all the rest of the waste stream,
right,
that's really challenging. And so I think a good example of the challenge we face is solar, right? So solar panels, as of 20 years ago, became incentivized and relatively common. But it turns out a solar panel doesn't have a perpetual lifespan either.
Right.
It's about 20 years. So a lot of those early solar panels are coming offline. And it turns out we don't know how to recycle them in California, much less absorb, the kind of the large numbers that are coming in. And so it's equally true that we really haven't thought about how to recycle car batteries, especially where every model is different. And when I'm done with my Tesla, there's no central recycling facility for that Tesla. Chances are when you're done with a Tesla, you've got a degraded battery, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to turn it in or sell it on the secondary market. But when that battery's, falls below some level where it's useful, it will be taken out either as part of a salvage operation or a replacement operation. And, we need to think about how to do that. Because, just think about 20 million cars, give or take, on the roads in California.
Right.
If and when, let's say 60%, 12 million of those are battery cars, that's a ton of mass coming in every year as that share comes offline. And we haven't really thought about those things, nor have we thought, I think, seriously about the front end environmental impacts of mining lithium ion, all these other things. So these things are complicated, right?
Yeah.
And so we can rightfully try and move off of fossil fuels because we know how they work and the damage they do. But there's no silver bullet. We're going to have to account for the downstream impacts of batteries as well at some point. Right. And that's where we as legislators have an obligation. And so I may say have 6 years left in my term limit. It's just as important for me, right, to think about 20 years down the road as we make policy today about recycling as it is about next year. And I'm always aware of that, and I hope my colleagues are as well.
Yeah, no, it's kind of interesting is because, you come up with these solutions and we're always pushing forward, right? But, you don't think about the other half. And 50 years ago, we thought nuclear power was great until we're like, oh, what about the waste?
Right.
So, yeah, coming full circle and always thinking about these things full term is always important. And glad you guys are taking a look at that.
Well, we should be. I mean, don't assume we are. So I'm glad that you're going to hopefully force, all of us to think seriously about these things.
Yeah. So, your district's changing a bit in 2 years. You're going to take a little bit more of the coast. And with that is a lot of responsibility, right? We have a lot of interest in protecting our oceans and things like that. Something you started this year was the California Ocean Corps. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about that?
Well, to be clear, it's something I tried to start, right? So let's put it in context. So something I tried to start. So a lot of your listeners will recall in 2021, mm-hmm. there was an oil spill.
Yep.
A pipeline was ruptured off the coast of Southern California, off Huntington Beach. And it turned out not to be a large spill, but the environmental impact was still huge. And so what was also kind of alarming to realize is that we didn't really have the resources or the workforce to very quickly respond to the environmental impacts caused by an oil spill of that nature. And so the idea came to me through the Orange County Conservation Corps. There's a wonderful woman named Catherine Munoz, who's the executive director. The Conservation Corps, if you're aware of it, does a lot of workforce development around conservation, right? Wild, forest management, a bunch of other things, coastal cleanups in the canals and stuff around Orange County. And so she had the idea, which made sense to me, which like there should be a program to train young people on kind of the skills needed for environmental disaster response, for coastal restoration, for climate change. And so, we applying the same model that they've used to build Conservation Corps, I proposed legislation that would create something called the California Ocean Corps. And the idea was, kind of obvious that, we should have a trained workforce in the event that we have the need in the future. And so as it moved through the legislative process, it was largely unanimous.
Right.
But in the appropriation stage, the budget allocation that we'd include in the legislation was removed. And then it got to the governor's desk and it was vetoed.
Right.
And his veto reason was, lack of
funding,
right?
Right.
So, he didn't want to make a commitment, obligate funding for something where we didn't know for sure that we would have the funding. And I guess I respect that generally, but the need still remains, right? And so, we're going to go back at it next legislative year to see if we can't figure out, a similar idea, maybe different legislative strategy to hopefully get that done.
Because it seems like something that does happen every, few years, right? There's some kind of disaster that happens, and you need to be ready to respond.
Right. And again, so not only are the environmental impacts substantial, the impacts on the local economy are equally important to consider, right? So, we actually generate way more revenue, like within our economy, for tourism, kind of coastal related things, than we do on energy. Not that there's not a need, over time to have a good source of energy. And so, you're smart if you can figure out how to minimize the impacts if and when these things happen.
Yeah. Kind of earlier we were talking about the problem solvers, and you're like, there's low hanging fruit there, things, bipartisan things we can focus on. First thing you mentioned was elections. And that's something that you've kind of been focusing on lately, kind of fairness and fundamental kind of democratic processes, something you've been working on. What are some of the things that, you're looking at in this space and kind of going forward, things that, you think that we can achieve?
So, for reasons I might not have chosen, I'm as knowledgeable about recall processes as anybody, right? So anybody who's watching is knowledgeable knows that, I was recalled in starting in 2017, but eventually in 2018, in response to the legislature raising the gas tax through a bill, SB 1. And I would argue, I was one of 81 people who voted for a bill. And because, as you mentioned earlier, I was, the winner of a very close election, the first Democrat to hold, what had been a Republican seat, for like 4 years. I was the obvious target for a recall effort, in the aftermath of raising people's gas taxes. And so, as they say, the guillotine is a wonderful way to focus one's attention. And so when you look at California's recall statute, it's part of a portfolio, 3 different provisions that date back to 1911 to progressive reformers who at the time were trying to solve for the problem where California was being dominated by commercial interests, especially the railroads. So it made sense in 1911 to create, a safety valve, as it were. So through the recall, the initiative, the referendum, so that the public could have recourse in the event that its government, was not responsive, or they wound up saddled with, malfeasant or corrupt public officials. And so the recall, as it was originally created, has 2 components, right? You have the first question, which is, should Josh Newman be recalled from the office of state senate? And if so, who should replace the recalled person? And that second question was necessary in 1911, right? Where effectively, like, the railroads kind of owned the political process, right? So you could propose somebody else. Today, it creates a different, set of incentives, which is, it allows people, and we saw this with the gubernatorial recall effort. It allows for a small group to go out and secure the necessary number of signatures, which, we can argue about the number, but they're low enough that it's achievable. In order to get through a special election what they couldn't get through a regular election.
Right.
And so that's what we saw last year through the attempt to recall the governor, where, he won with a very convincing margin, but, they secured enough signatures, especially during the pandemic, to get the recall going. And that created a bunch of incentives because Larry Elder, for instance, who never would have run as a candidate in the general, had an opportunity through, this very strange, very specific opportunity to become governor of California. That the presence of that second question creates a set of incentives, I think, that were never intended. So I've got a constitutional amendment that I'll be reintroducing this year that would reform the state's recall provision to keep the first question. By all means, let's give the people the right to expel an otherwise unfit member. But in the event that they are, we should use the existing means for replacing people. So if the governor were to go on, do something else, or God forbid, pass away, the lieutenant governor would ascend to that office. So in the event that the governor is corrupt and we need to recall him or her, the lieutenant governor till the next election, I think, should replace the governor. If you do that, you take a lot of the politics out of it. It becomes, I think, what was intended becomes a matter of integrity or morality, right? And then if it's a constitutional officer, the governor could reappoint till the next election. And if it's a legislator, same as if I went off and did something else, or God forbid died, they'd have a special election to replace me. So I think if we did that, it makes sense. And then it sort of solves for some of the political friction where everybody's gaming everything these days, right? And the partisanship, leads to this sort of intensive sort of Cold War where there's a loophole for anything, and if there's a loophole, somebody will find it. That happens to be kind of a constitutional weakness that's been exploited in a bunch of ways that I don't think were intended. So I think that's part of the solution.
No, interesting.
Yeah.
It's election season right now. Next Tuesday is election day. What are some of the things that that are an issue that a lot of us aren't front of mind, and some other things you're working on?
So I mean, to be clear, like I'm not up for election on Tuesday. So I have an odd numbered Senate district. So that Senate has 40 members. So we run 21 cycle, 20 the other.
Right.
And so I haven't enjoyed an election season this much for a long time.
Sit back and watch.
It's awesome. Yeah. And so the things I think, so there's a lot of new blood coming in, because of the intersection of term limits on the one hand and then redistricting on the other. So we're going to see, a very large number of new members of the legislature because there are a whole bunch of races where there's no incumbent who's running for election. So, every district is different, but I think at the macro level, homelessness is a big deal, for people. Crime is an equally big deal. Cost of living in California is appropriately a big deal. So those three things together, I think, are informing a lot of voters' sensibilities when it comes to whom they might choose to represent them in the next cycle. And so again, at the local level, each candidate handles it differently.
Right.
And so I'm I think just good enough to figure out how to get myself elected, or maybe lucky enough.
Right.
And so I in watching other people do their thing, democracy is a fascinating thing.
Has anybody asked to borrow the ice cream truck?
Yes, I have lent I have lent the ice cream truck to lots of some of my neighbors who are running for like lesser, lower office, I should say lesser, school district, city council. Made the mistake of lending the ice cream truck to somebody in Santa Monica, whom I didn't really know very well. He seemed like a decent guy, but it turns out he's not the favorite dude, and a whole bunch of people I know are all mad at me because of it. So I'd say to anybody, go out and buy your own ice cream truck, right?
It's a no-brainer.
It's a no-brainer, right?
It's can you wrap the ice cream sandwiches in Newman for Senate?
No, we had that old discussion, right? When I did, and I had a bunch of friends.
FPPC number.
No. So everybody said you got to get find an ice cream company that'll make it, package it for a private label. And then I realized people are just going to unwrap it and throw the wrapper away. So when during campaign season, when you get an ice cream sandwich from me, you get a generic ice cream sandwich, but you get a little pamphlet, right? And so my wife was funny. She was like, well, what about people who are lactose intolerant, right? Or vegan or whatever. And initially I was like, you know what? They can have the pamphlet, right? It's free. And it turns out enough people were like, my daughter doesn't eat milk, right? So we carry popsicles now, the things branded ice cream. Yeah, totally. But I thought at that price, I get to choose. So you get a popsicle. That's the other option.
That's good.
Yeah.
Good diversity there. Yeah. All inclusive ice cream truck.
Right.
I guess now that you're not running, you kind of have this time to kind of sit back and think. We have a new session coming up, new 2-year session. Kind of, are you coming up with bill ideas, and do you already have ideas of things you want to do next year that you think?
I got a bunch, right? So which is when I say my office, my staff. So I think we've got probably 25 concepts we're kind of working through that they either originated. Idea I had, staff had, where a constituent came with an idea, or an advocate came and said hey, there's a problem that needs solving. So over the next 2 months, the bill submission deadline is February 15th, give or take. We'll pare that down. Oddly, people probably don't realize legislative session is defined as 2 years, and within each session, every member has a quota of how many bills you're allowed to introduce. And so in the Senate, where there's 40 members, our quota is 40 or 20 per year on average per member. In the Assembly, for whatever reason, where there's twice as many members, they have a quota of 50, or give or take 25 per year. And that is why, more than anything, like why when people watch, there's so many bills, right? Especially at the end of the year, there's this tidal wave of legislation that we're, sort of working our way through. And so, I've typically carried between 12 and 15 bills a year. Last year, I was, I think, successful insofar as I got 10 of the 11 signed, through and signed by the governor. The one being the one we discussed,
Right.
36. And so, we're looking at a bunch of bills that, that are, again, election reform, energy related. I've got some ideas about housing, zoning, a bunch of other things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't want to commit to anything because you wind up, as you research these things, you find out what either needs to be done or the challenges in doing what seems really obvious going in. You can often find yourself really surprised that turns out either the impact on a particular function is way more substantial than you think, or the unintended impact is not something you've considered.
Yeah. One thing kind of you mentioned before we started was kind of this driver's license issue for kids in high school.
My best idea. Well, I'm glad you're presenting that way. So my best idea, it maybe, and the idea is, everybody in California has either an ID card or a driver's license, right? And if you're driving, you're required to have it. But in my experience, most people don't like their driver's license photo, and you are stuck with that thing for
10 years
for a while, right? For a while. And so the idea is, what if you let people pay a little extra to get the driver's license photo that they actually like, right? And so there's a couple of scenarios. One is you go in and I can pay like being at the county fair, I can more tries to win. So if I get to see my picture, if I don't like it, I can pay a couple bucks, take it again, till I like it, right? And so, or there's another scenarios
like lobbyists with their headshots, right?
Well, totally. And the other scenario is, sort of like your passports. You can go have it taken at a studio and, they can glam you up as long as it meets the spec, right? You're looking in the camera and you're not smiling and all that stuff. You could pay $100. Maybe the state would get its fair share of that. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a bunch of money there. I feel like, I've been market testing this idea. Like very few people like their driver's license photo. I mean, like most people I've talked to, I have to pay extra. And so I don't know that the DMV likes this. I had a meeting with Steve at the DMV to kind of prep him for this brilliant idea I have. But the goal is actually not just that. The part of the goal, of this idea is to generate funds to fund driver's education in the public schools. And many people may not be aware of this, especially if you don't have kids. And if you're my age, you probably took driver's ed in school, right? You had a classroom component, and most schools had that car that had like the 2 steering wheels, 2 sets of brakes, and your teacher drove with you. That doesn't exist anymore in California. As of certainly 2008, after the recession, when we had to make some really hard choices on priorities, a lot of things fell by the wayside, including driver's ed at schools. Now, it's technically still in the curriculum, but if you've got a child, right, who's 16 years old or 16 and a half when you're eligible to get your license, that kid can't get their driver's license unless they've taken an accredited driver's ed course. And you can only take those courses through private entities, and it's expensive. It's about $600 on average, which is, for working parents, that's real money, especially if you don't have a car that you can, lend to your kid to do all this stuff or take them out to drive when they're doing it. And so that has a real impact on young people and on families with young people, right? So if you're a kid from a family of means, you can do that. You can start driving at 16 and a half. You can go out and get the kind of employment experiences that we all took for granted because you can get to work, you can get to your teams, et cetera.
Right.
If you're from a family that doesn't do that, you can't, right? And so so that gap compounds, right? And that broader question about income inequality and sort of the differences that sort of devolve around that are real in California. And there's also a safety concern. I mean, all the studies show that somebody who has taken driver's ed is a demonstrably better driver for the first 5 years of their driving than somebody who has not. We all pay a price for that. So serious policy goal, with kind of a, otherwise kind of fun idea around the pictures. But if we do that, I think it would make a difference.
No, that's shocking to me that that driver's ed isn't free anymore. The kind of
not at all
big discrepancy between haves and have not there.
Right.
Maybe that's why everyone's saying a lot of kids aren't getting their driver's license anymore. That's probably a big
reason. I believe so there's this conversation. Say, kids are so into their devices and they do the rideshare, but people only sort of gravitate toward things that are within the realm of the possible for them. And so if your family's never going to pay for driver's ed, you probably think differently, right? So again, like I'm aware, think of all those experiences I had as a teenager that involved getting from A to B in a car And when I got my license the day I could get my license, and then the whole world opened up. I could do a bunch of stuff. And if it didn't, I'd have had different experiences.
No, definitely. Well, Josh, it's been awesome talking with you. Learned a lot. Definitely going to look you up on YouTube to see that viral fembot scene.
You're definitely looking forward to that. So for your listeners, you can search it. So I don't know why, but that one scene is actually excerpted on YouTube. So if you just use the word fembot in the search bar, and it'll come up either the first or second one. It's like a minute 43 or minute 46, I forget what. And it's that scene, and you'll see it's like, I'm not overpromising anything. It's really brief, but if you look, I'm the middle guard. Who gets shot by the fembots.
You're definitely one of the more interesting members we've had on. You have a bear suit, an ice cream truck, and
an IMDb the profile. But thank you.
Get look at it. And if our listeners want to follow you along on social and stuff like that, where can they find you?
Oh God, I don't know. I don't really pay attention to my social. So like, just Google it. You'll find it. I'm embarrassed, but I can never remember. I have somebody.
A modest man.
I don't know.
Totally.
Sorry. Yeah.
All right, Josh. Well, thank you so much. Great talk with you.
Thank you for having me.